Welcome. In our last lesson, we learned how our newly formed colors react and relate to each other by exploring the color wheel. We also discovered the strange and mysterious black and white, which are not really colors at all in the true sense, but rather shades. So then, what is the purpose of these unusual hues? They provide lightness and darkness to enrich our world. At first, these terms might bring to mind the eerie shadows of the forest and the glowing white specters that lurk there, or the blinding white fury of a lightning strike against an inky black sky. But these pigments are not to be feared. They breathe life into an otherwise mundane existence. They transform the flat, lifeless circle into an energetic, bouncing ball. A plain, unassuming square now seems to leap off the page as a three-dimensional cube, and a humble triangle is metamorphosized into a majestic pyramid. With the addition of darkness and light, our world now comes alive with the birth of shadows and highlights. Shadows are areas that are hidden from the light. They are formed by the object itself blocking the light. In reality, shadows are very rarely pure black. To create shadows in art, you can add a tiny amount of black to the complementary color of the original shade. For example, a red object would have a dark green shadow. To create a more natural color of black in paint, you can also mix blue and brown together. This will provide more depth than black straight out of the paint tube. There are two kinds of shadows. A form shadow is the darkest and is produced at the furthest point from the light. Cast shadows are caused by the object blocking the light. They occur on the surface the object is resting on or next to. Highlights usually occur at the highest point of an object, closest to the light source. They are rarely pure white, as they also contain hints of surrounding colors. Pure white highlights are reserved for the brightest area of an eye or a water drop. Highlights are what make your paintings pop. To create highlights in art, add a tiny amount of white to the main color and add a tiny amount of surrounding color as well. You can also use the warm complementary color to the base color. For example, a red object would have a warm green highlight added to the white. To clearly identify where your highlights and shadows will be, you can always look at your reference photo in black and white. Now that we understand the basics of highlights and shadows, we'll use these concepts to bring flat circles and lines to life with this intriguing basket of fresh apples. So the materials will be listed below for this project that we're going to be working on today. I'm going to be using this mixed media paper from Canson, which you can use, but you might want to start off by using a canvas since there are a lot of layers on this painting, and if you're just a beginner you might end up ripping your paper, but it's up to you. Either will work perfectly fine. You just want to make sure that it's good for acrylic paint. I also have some wax paper here to protect your work surface, especially if you're going to be using a canvas. A paper plate is going to be used for our palette. Paper towel for any cleanup. And our primary colors of acrylic craft paint in red, yellow, and a dark blue. We're also going to be using black and white to shade and tint. We're going to need some painter's tape to make a frame around our painting. Even if you're going to be using a canvas, you will need the painter's tape to make the textured background. Again, just using household supplies, we have a kitchen sponge, some Q-tips, some toothpicks, and a new addition, we're going to be using these triangular makeup sponges. First off, we're going to get our blank paper set up, or your canvas, and we're going to have it in the landscape position. Next, we're going to take our painter's tape, and this is only if you're going to be using paper and not canvas. But again, before you put it on your paper, you want to place it on your pants or another surface and peel it off a few times just to get rid of some of the tackiness so that it doesn't rip your paper. So we're going to put a strip along the top, along the bottom, and on the sides. And again, this is only if you're using paper and not a canvas. So first of all, we're going to be working on the wood background. And there's a really cool technique that I've learned to make a fake wood background. You'll also need some water to dampen your sponge. So the important thing to remember when we're going to paint this background is to make sure you go in long horizontal strokes. You don't want to go back and forth like you're painting, and you also don't want to blend too much. So first of all, we're going to completely dampen our sponge, and we want to wring out as much water as possible and dry it a bit on our paper towel. We just want it barely damp, not soaking wet. So to create the weathered look of the wood, we're going to use some white paint and some black paint. So we're going to put about a quarter-sized dollop of white paint onto our plate. You don't want too much paint out at once because acrylic paint dries very quickly. Then we're going to want a similar size dollop of black paint. So for this technique, we want to take the end of the sponge, put the middle into white paint, then just dab a tiny bit on each corner. You don't want too much black, otherwise you'll end up with a gray paint. So then starting at the top of your paper or canvas, you just want to gently drag your sponge along. Now we're not creating the individual boards of the wood right now, we're just trying to get the weathered look. So you don't want to press too hard. If you run out of paint, just go back and do the same technique again by dipping the middle edge of the sponge in white and then a tiny bit on each end of the black. So you just want to keep going back and forth across until you fill up your page. So it is important to not blend too much or you will end up with a solid gray background, but you can go over it a few times until you're happy with the way it looks. Once you're happy with it, you want it to dry completely before continuing on to the next step. Now, if you're like me, you can speed up the drying process with a hairdryer, or you can just let it sit for 5 or 10 minutes and it should be fine. So now we are going to make the individual boards on our background. You will complete this step if you're using a canvas or the paper. So we're going to take some painters or masking tape again, tear off a strip to go the whole length of your paper, and again put it on your pants or some other cloth surface a few times just to get rid of the sticky. And we're going to look at our reference photo and see approximately where the placement of the individual boards are. It doesn't have to be exact, but we're going to put pieces of tape on to represent the number of boards that we want. Now we're going to take a slightly damp makeup sponge and dip it into a tiny bit of black paint. And we're going to run this along the edge of the masking tape. Now I would suggest starting on the actual tape just to get most of it off, because you just want a very tiny line. We're going to go along one edge of each piece of tape. Now this is the magical part. When you gently peel back the tape, it will look like pieces of wood. Just be careful when you're peeling it back so that you don't rip your paper. Now we're going to just touch up some areas with the white and black. Anywhere that you think is too dark, or if you made a little boo-boo, you can cover it up with white. Or if you think a spot is too light, you can add a little bit more black. This is the beauty with acrylic paint. You can paint right over top of white and black and it will cover nicely. So just go through to finish up any of the lines and make it look the way you'd like, checking out the reference photo as you go. Using our makeup sponge, again with a tiny bit of black, we're going to add a few little details to our wood to make it look more realistic. Look at the reference photo and see if there's any little cracks or knot holes or marks or anything like that, and just sort of make the basic shape with the black. We're going to go over it with white again just to define the shapes. So taking a clean makeup sponge, we're going to dip into a tiny bit of white and again go over the black a little bit just to kind of define the shapes of the knot holes and the cracks, paying close attention to your reference photo. To add even more minute details, we're going to take our Q-tips now and dip them into the black paint so we can more define our little knot holes and cracks. So keep repeating this process with the black and the white until you're happy with it. Now you don't always have to follow a reference photo exactly, but if you take a look at ours, you can see that some of the boards are lighter than others, so you may want to add a bit more white and a bit more black to some of the boards, just to make it look closer to the photo. Now we'll set that aside to dry and we'll talk about some color mixing. Now with this dollar store craft paint, the colors won't be as true as when we get into using real acrylic paint because there's not as much pigment in it. But we will lay out a dollop of red, yellow, blue, white, and black on a piece of wax paper just to see what we learned last time. So some people might be wondering, how do we get brown that we need? Well, we learned that if we mix all three primary colors, we will get black. Brown is just sort of a lighter, orangier shade of black. So if we mix all three colors together, we will get a bit of a brown shade. So again, the color quality in this cheaper dollar store paint is not the greatest, but we will be repeating this exercise again in future lessons with better quality, higher pigmented paint, and you'll really be able to see the difference. So once we get a brown tone on here, if we just add a tiny bit of white, we'll make a lighter brown. If we put a tiny bit of black, we'll get a darker brown. We can also test out that if we mix our primary colors together, we'll get our secondary colors. So red and yellow will make a shade of orange. We can add a bit of white to get a light tint of orange, or a bit of black to get a darker shade of orange. Now if we mix yellow and blue, those two primary colors, we'll get a nice shade of green. And again, you can lighten it and make a tint by putting white and making a lighter green, or you can make a shade by adding a bit of dark to make a darker green. And finally, if we mix the primary color of red and blue together, we will get purple. And same thing, you can make a tint by adding a bit of white to get more of a lilac color, or you can put a bit of black in to get a dark, deep violet shade. Now these are the only colors that we're going to be using for our painting today. We're going to be doing some color mixing to try to get the secondary and tertiary colors. However, I would suggest for this painting to use some brown paint, just because with the cheaper paint, the brown that you get by mixing the primary colors together is not really a good color. So in order to make your painting look better, I would stick with using a bottled brown paint. But again, we can add some white to make a nice tint and light brown, or we could add some black to shade to make a darker shade of brown. These will all come in handy while we're doing our highlights and shades. So now that our canvas or paper is completely dry, we're going to look at our reference photo and see the position of the basket and the apples. Now you can just draw it on freehand with a regular pencil like I'm doing here, or you can use the traceable that's provided and some tracing paper and put it onto your paper or canvas. So now we're going to put out the colors for our basket. We're going to use some of the brown, a little bit of yellow, and a little bit of white. So taking another makeup sponge, we're going to mix a little bit of these three colors together just to kind of get a nice warm light brown. This is going to be the base layer for our basket. Now using smooth downward strokes, we're just going to outline the shape of our basket just by going straight up and down to fill in the basic shape. It doesn't matter right now if some of the layers are a little bit darker or lighter, that will just add dimension to your basket. We're going to do what we did with our barn boards, and we're going to take our makeup sponge and dip the middle part of it into the white and just a little tiny bit on the edge of the dark brown, and we're going to go straight up and down to create the slats in the basket. Next, we're going to take a slightly damp Q-tip and dip it in the red paint and lay down the base coat for the apples. Make sure to check your reference photo for the placement of the apples, and as you can see, there's 3 big ones in the front, then there's 2 little tiny ones hiding in the background. So painting is all about layers, so we're going to add another layer to the wood slats in our basket. So we're going to take our makeup sponge and use the same technique of white in the center and a dot of brown in either corner to reinforce the slats in the basket. Then we're just going to touch up any areas that we missed, and we're going to let this dry before proceeding to part 2, which is going to be the shading. This will bring our painting to life.